Mr. Bull said no case is perfect, sort of lumping this in with other investigations. What I'm going to ask of you is over the course of this trial to look and see if you think this was a normal, imperfect investigation or if very significant parts of this investigation simply weren't completed, weren't followed, weren't done. I'm going to address some of what the state said. But first, I'm going to go through a different view of this. You're going to hear about 132 Perry Street. That is where Shirley Carter lived and where she died. It's also where Jason Carter was born and raised all the way through high school. It's where he took his children during the winter, maybe once a week to see their grandparents. During the summer when they had hogs there, 3, 4, 5, 6 times a week. Because his mother helped his son Chase, who raised hogs for the fair. She would feed them in the morning on days like this where Chase had football practice. At night, they would often eat together. You'll get to see pictures of this home, video of this home. It's a modest home, but it's a house where there was always lunch meat in the refrigerator drawer, and usually a pie stored in the microwave. Now here's Jason Carter's view of that day. He got up in the morning early, took his son to football practice just as the state said. He went, started his semi. He went to Casey's, got himself a donut, got in his semi, drove his load to the Cargill plant. And to this degree, we agree with the state's timeline. And then he drove back and got his pickup, went to his parents' house where he was going to do some spraying for his father. And since it was around 11 o'clock, and we'll talk very specifically about exactly what time later, he decided to go into the house and have some food, lunch meat, and probably some pie. And he found his mother dead on the floor. He went where he grabbed her leg. He called his sister. He called 911. He called his father. He called his brother. He called his father. He tried calling his mother's number because sometimes his father had that cell phone. Now, let me go through some of the points made by the state. The state starts out by saying that this may be financially motivated. Well, I would ask you to wait and hear what the real financial situation was. The statement was made there was only $100 in the bank, but I believe you'll find out that there was a $3,000 check deposited that day and another check for $3,000 in the mail and $175,000 worth of grain in the bins. And I think you'll find out that Jason Carter was doing very well as a farmer. Was his credit line the highest it had ever been? Absolutely. Would that be true of most newer growing operations? Absolutely. Now, there were a lot of things that the state said, Jason Carter knew this, Jason Carter knew that, Jason Carter knew this. I'm going to ask you to hold on and listen to what the evidence really shows. Jason Carter gave statement after statement after statement, a short statement, and then an 11-hour grilling, and more statements, and more testimony. And what the state has done is given you little bits of things that were said at different times in different contexts. And I'm going to ask you to wait and hear what was really said in their whole context. And then at the end of this case, take a look at those statements. Now, I am going to talk about the statement of Billy Carter Jr., Jason's older brother. because that was the statement where the state said, Billy Jr. says that Jason Carter said, would they have to rack another round? Billy Carter's the only person who says that. And we'll talk about many of the statements that Billy Carter Jr. makes. But I will tell you, one of the statements was immediately upon arriving at the scene. Before knowing much of anything, Billy Carter Jr. says, do you think they used the .270 that I gave to Dad? Which is the suspected weapon in this case. And we'll talk about that too, because it's not definite that it's that weapon, but certainly there's a lot of evidence that indicates it is. But Billy Carter Jr. was the first person to ever mention that weapon in particular. Now, it is absolutely true that there were times where Jason Carter's emotions went up and down. And there's a phrase, a roller coaster of emotions, that comes from somewhere. And that's because that's natural. People go through up and down emotions in cycles. But you will get a chance to hear the statements of Jason Carter, some of them out of context. And when the state puts on their evidence, I will ask you to wait to make up your mind, because some of those statements will be out of context. We'll put in some additional information to put those in context. But you'll be able to see and hear and decide for yourselves what sounds real, what you believe. But let me just point out, the state says, well, Jason Carter went and put that phone away. But you'll also find out that when law enforcement said, we think you have a second phone, where is it? Jason Carter said where it was. He hadn't moved it and went and got the phone. And there were no gloves and no spent shell casing or no other thing hidden there. So ask yourself, does it really make sense that this is somehow indicative of some motive or some hidden evidence? Over and over I'm going to ask, does this make sense? But certainly we're going to talk about this investigation. And there are a lot of reports about where the murder weapon might have been. Individuals who may have confessed, a possible recording of a confession of a burglar who says that he was involved in the death of Shirley Carter. And look at what law enforcement did and did not do in response to those. We're going to talk about another statement too, and that's the statement of Bill Carter Sr., who arrives on the scene, grabs his wife, holds her, and thereafter says, she was stiff as a board. She was in rigor mortis. And I know what rigor mortis is. And Bill Carter says, I know what rigor mortis is. I was a butcher. She was stiff as a board, she was cold. And I believe everyone who testifies will agree that if that's true, it would be impossible for Jason Carter to have been the killer, because it simply puts it out of the time frame when he would have been there. There are a lot of questionable statements here. Another statement was made that Bill Carter arrived and then within 7 minutes ran to see if the pigs had been fed while his wife was on the floor. Ask yourself, does that time frame really make sense? Over and over again, I'm going to ask you, does this really all fit together? Does this really make sense? Or are there giant gaping holes because there was an investigation? I wrote notes as we went through this. And I'll just straight disagree that Ms. Hoke says it was unusual to stop texting. I think she said just the opposite. I think she'll say that it was not unusual. And I think, man, there are a lot of this. Well, let's talk about the last thing, the Carter Farms. I think the implication looming was that a month before her death, Jason Carter had some sort of plan to take over Carter Farms, and it created this email instead of Broadview Farms, which is what was incorporated under. Well, the side of his truck has said Carter Farms forever, and he goes by Carter Farms, and has. It never said Broadview Farms on the side of the farm, so the truck. So let's not make this into the last looming detail. And then there was the implication that there was friction. Bill Carter and Jana Carter and Billy Carter will all testify. And I believe they will all testify that Jason was over at the house, that he spent time with his mother, that his mother was proud of him, happy with him, that they were together often, and that none of them had seen friction, sadness, and that there had been no arguments asking for land, that there had been normal communication. And I believe the state's own expert is going to say that he didn't believe that this particular crime, whoever committed it, was committed as a planned thing, that he believed it was spontaneous, not planned, not decided, based on whatever evidence he reviewed. And I'm going to ask you at the end to look at the timeline. And there are a number of things in the timeline I will ask you to look at. The time of death for Shirley Carter, the drive time, which we dispute, for Jason Carter, and if the state's own expert is correct that this was a spontaneous crime, does this even make sense that there was that time? The state put a timeline in front of you. Well, I'll give you a little spoiler alert. We're going to put a timeline in front of you in closing statements. And it'll have a lot of things that are the same. But in the end, I will ask you to look at the time of death and the real opportunity even. I will say the state's right about one thing. They don't have to prove motive. But I do think you can look at, was there a motive? And I believe the evidence will show there wasn't. That Jason Carter was a son who loved his mother, spent a lot of time with her, and that now he's in that chair, unable to take the time to grieve because of some statements that have been taken out of context. I've gone to a lot of seminars and training, and they all say at the end, don't ever say, we don't know who. Point at someone. Say, that's the killer. Just come up with someone. I can't do that. What I will point at is an investigation that never followed up on leads, evidence. And let me just say, the state said, that's right, they didn't find one gun, or they didn't find a grenade, or they didn't take a live round and a gun safe. Before I finish, I'm going to go back and talk about that gun safe. Actually, I'm going to talk about two things. There was a statement by the state that Jason Carter was trying to fill in the gaps by saying he greased the zerts and checked the sprayer and started everything. Wait and listen to what the real statement about that is and what was actually said, because I dispute that that's what or how it was said. But I can tell you this. If Jason Carter was supposedly setting up some alibi, he talked with law enforcement right after that, and he certainly never said that to law enforcement. Never once said, I started the sprayer, or I checked on the sprayer, or I greased the sprayer. Never said that. So how do we suppose that this one statement that an acquaintance says he heard was an alibi if he didn't just after that say it to law enforcement? That doesn't make sense. But I will again, we'll talk about exactly the context. And there, as I said, in jury selection, the state goes first, and they get to choose the order of their witnesses, and their evidence is going to come in chronologically and logically and organized. Because we're second, it's going to be a little bit of information here and there, and that's just how it is. That's why I asked you early, can you wait and make up your mind? It's because there will be a lot of information we won't even disagree with for the beginning of this trial, and we'll make little points here and there. But at the end, I believe the evidence will show the timeline doesn't make sense. There was no motive. The statements were taken completely out of context. And very significant pieces of evidence weren't followed through. So when the state says to you, all clues point to one conclusion, it's all the clues that the tunnel vision of law enforcement, and one investigator in particular, went after. They were absolutely focused on Jason Carter and ignored all the other clues. And what I will say to you at the conclusion of this case, I will ask you, do all clues really point to one conclusion, or were there many that were ignored or incomplete or insufficiently followed? And at the end of this case, I will ask you, can you really base a case on an incomplete investigation and clues that weren't followed? And I will ask you at that time to enter a verdict of not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brown.